Sinister Bells of Alderwick Churchyard, a Miss Marple mystery. When the bells rang too often. Settle in, dear listener, and let us travel to a place where time is measured not in hours, but in tolls of a bell. Alderwick Churchyard sits on the edge of the village, enclosed by ancient stone walls softened by moss and memory. Its crooked headstones lean like weary witnesses, and its bell tower has for generations marked every baptism, wedding, and farewell with unwavering regularity. The bell has always rung for the living, until one evening when it rings for the wrong reason. The villagers hear it at dusk, slow, deliberate tolls echoing across the fields long after services have ended. By the time anyone dares to investigate, a body is discovered among the graves, positioned with unsettling care, as though placed rather than fallen. There are no signs of struggle, no footprints disturbed, no explanation for why the bell rang at all. The village agrees on a story almost immediately. A tragic accident. A lonely soul wandering too close to old memories. An unfortunate fall among the stones. But Miss Jane Marple, visiting Alderwick to pay her respects to a distant acquaintance, notices what others overlook. She notices the rope of the bell, recently handled. She notices the position of the body, too deliberate to be chance. And she notices how fiercely the villagers insist that nothing unusual has happened. Churchyards are places of remembrance, but Miss Marple knows they are also places of arrangement, where what is seen is carefully chosen, and what is hidden is often buried deeper than the dead. As the bell falls silent once more, Miss Marple becomes quietly certain of one thing. This death was not an accident of grief. It was an act of intention. And in Alderwick, someone has used the language of ritual to disguise something far more sinister. The bell that should not have rung. Alderwick Churchyard had never been a place of surprises. It lay just beyond the village green, enclosed by a low stone wall that time had softened but never breached. The headstones leaned at varying angles, some upright with dignity, others bowed as though tired of standing. The bell tower rose above them all, solid, familiar, and trusted. That was why the ringing unsettled everyone. The first toll came just after dusk, slow, measured, deliberate. Those still in the fields paused, tools hanging loosely from their hands. In cottages along the lane, windows opened and faces appeared, puzzled rather than alarmed. Evening bells were not unheard of, but these were wrong in tone, wrong in timing. 5 tolls, then silence. By the time a small group made their way toward the churchyard, the sky had deepened into indigo. The iron gate stood open, though it was always shut at night. The body was found near the oldest yew tree. He lay on his back between 2 graves, hands folded neatly across his chest, coat straightened, hat placed carefully beside him. There was no blood, no sign of a fall, no disturbance of the gravel path nearby. If not for the stillness of his chest, he might have been sleeping. "It's Mr. Alfred Crowe," someone whispered. "The bell ringer." Miss Jane Marple arrived shortly after, having heard the bell from the guest room of the house where she was staying. She walked slowly, leaning on her umbrella, her eyes already busy. Mr. Crowe had rung Alderwick's bell for nearly 40 years. He was a man of habit, precision, and reverence for routine. He rang the bell exactly when required and never otherwise. Miss Marple noticed at once that the bell rope hanging from the tower window was not looped as usual. It had been hastily dropped. She stepped closer to the body and observed the placement. Too tidy. People who fell did not arrange themselves so neatly, nor did they place their hats aside with such care. "Looks like his heart," the constable said. "No sign of violence." "No," Miss Marple agreed gently. "But signs are not limited to force." She bent slightly and examined the soles of Mr. Crow's shoes. Clean. For a man found in a graveyard, they were remarkably free of soil. Miss Marple straightened and glanced toward the bell tower.
"Who rang the bell?" she asked quietly. A pause followed. "No one," Mrs. Bellamy said quickly. "That's the strange thing." Miss Marple tilted her head. "The bell does not ring itself." "But Alfred was found here," the constable replied. "Perhaps he rang it before collapsing." Miss Marple looked again at the rope. The fibers near the knot were slightly frayed, recently handled roughly. Mr. Crow had been meticulous. She turned her attention to the villagers. No one was crying, no one was shocked, only uncomfortable. "Did Mr. Crow expect visitors tonight?" Miss Marple asked. "No," said the vicar. "He kept to himself." "And yet," Miss Marple replied, "someone knew he would come here." She walked slowly around the body, noting the alignment with the graves, not random, deliberate. "Why place him here?" she murmured. No one answered. That evening the bell tower was locked, the body removed quietly, and Alderwick attempted to settle back into its familiar hush. The villagers spoke in careful tones, already agreeing on a narrative. A lonely man, an overworked heart, an unfortunate coincidence. Miss Marple sat by her window later that night, knitting steadily. Mr. Crow had rung the bell too often for coincidence. He had not fallen. He had been positioned. And the bell, trusted, respected, unquestioned, had been used not to mark time, but to summon witnesses. Someone in Alderwick had understood ritual very well, and had used it to disguise something deeply wrong. Do you believe the bell was rung by Mr. Crow himself, or by someone who wanted the village to look in the wrong direction? Share your theory below. The rope and the ritual. Miss Marple had always believed that rituals were humanity's way of reassuring itself that chaos could be contained. In Alderwick, the bell was the strongest ritual of all. The morning after Alfred Crow's death dawned pale and hesitant, as though the village itself were unsure whether it ought to continue as usual. The bell did not ring for matins, nor did it ring at noon. Its silence pressed against the cottages with a weight that felt almost accusatory. Miss Marple made her way to the churchyard early, before speculation could fully take root. The gate had been closed again, latched carefully, as though someone wished to erase the fact that it had ever stood open at night. Dew lay thick on the grass, undisturbed except for one narrow path leading from the tower to the yew tree. Miss Marple followed it slowly. The gravel had been raked, but not thoroughly. A faint line showed where something heavy had been dragged, then lifted. A body did not walk itself into place. Inside the bell tower, the air smelled of old stone and rope fibers. The bell rope hung down in an untidy coil, quite unlike Alfred Crow's usual meticulous loop. Miss Marple touched it lightly. The fibers near the end were roughened, the rope twisted at an angle that suggested haste rather than habit. Someone unfamiliar with its weight had pulled it too sharply. "Alfred never did that," came a voice behind her. Miss Marple turned to find Mr. Leonard Pierce, the churchwarden, standing awkwardly in the doorway.
He treated the bell like a living thing, Pierce continued. Respected it. Yes, Miss Marple replied, which makes last night rather disrespectful, doesn't it? Pierce swallowed. You think someone else rang it? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that bells do not break their own rules. As they stepped back into the churchyard, Miss Marple asked about Alfred Crowe's habits. He rang for services, Pierce said. Funerals, weddings, never outside those times. And yet he was here after dusk, Miss Marple noted. Pierce hesitated. He sometimes checked the ropes in the evening, said it helped him think. About what? Miss Marple asked. Pierce looked uncomfortable. About being replaced. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. Replaced? There's talk, Pierce admitted. Younger hands, modernizing. Alfred didn't like it. Miss Marple nodded. Change often sounds louder than bells. Later that morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Edith Langley, who lived in a cottage overlooking the churchyard. I saw the light, Mrs. Langley said readily, in the tower, just before the bell rang. Did you see who lit it? Miss Marple asked. No, the woman replied, but I heard voices, too. Miss Marple stored that away. At the village shop, speculation had already hardened. He must have slipped, one man said. Or rang too hard, said another. Old hearts give out, concluded a third. Miss Marple listened quietly. Old hearts did fail, but rarely with such careful arrangement. That afternoon, the vicar, Reverend Matthew Hargreaves, received Miss Marple in the vestry. His expression was earnest, his manner composed. Alfred was devoted, he said. The bell was his life. Did he seem troubled recently? Miss Marple asked. The vicar hesitated. He was upset about certain decisions. About his position? Miss Marple prompted. Yes, Hargreaves admitted. The parish council discussed alternatives. And did Alfred know? Miss Marple asked. He suspected, the vicar said. We tried to reassure him. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Reassurance is often mistaken for resolution. As evening approached, Miss Marple returned once more to the bell tower. She stood beneath the bell and looked up at its dark bronze curve. Someone had rung it not to mark a moment, but to frame one, to ensure discovery, to create witnesses, to lend authority to a death that might otherwise raise questions. Alfred Crowe had not rung the bell for himself. He had been brought there because the bell would speak for whoever wished to remain silent. Miss Marple left the tower with a growing certainty. The bell had not summoned the village by accident. It had been used as an alibi. And somewhere in Alderwick, someone understood ritual well enough to weaponize it. Do you think Alfred Crowe was killed because he stood in the way of change? Or because he knew something he shouldn't? Share your theory below. The man who knew the timing. Miss Marple had often remarked that murderers rarely chose places at random. They chose moments. In Alderwick, the moment had been dusk, the hour when the bell's sound carried farthest, when shadows softened details, and when villagers were most likely to notice without intervening. Miss Marple began her day at the parish council office, a cramped room adjoining the vestry where papers accumulated faster than decisions were made. She leafed through meeting notes with quiet persistence. There it was, a proposal dated 2 weeks earlier. Discussion regarding modernization of bell-ringing duties. Modernization was a gentle word, Miss Marple thought. It often meant removal. She read further. The proposal suggested rotating volunteers,
installing an automated system for weekday tolls, and, most tellingly, relieving Mr. Alfred Crowe of sole responsibility. Miss Marple closed the folder slowly. Alfred Crowe had been more than a bell ringer. He had been a keeper of time, a gatekeeper of ritual. Someone who knew exactly when people came and went, who attended funerals, who lingered after services, who argued quietly in the vestry when doors were shut. People like that noticed things. She left the office and walked toward the vicarage, where Reverend Matthew Hargreaves was waiting with an air of strained patience.
Alfred was difficult, the vicar admitted when Miss Marple asked directly. Resistant to change. But loyal, Miss Marple said.
Yes, Hargreaves replied, to a fault.
And was loyalty ever inconvenient? Miss Marple asked gently.
The vicar hesitated. He questioned decisions.
Such as? Miss Marple pressed.
Scheduling, Hargreaves said carefully. Who used the church? When? For what purpose? Miss Marple nodded.
The bell sees much, does it not?
That afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Thomas Reed, a young man recently arrived in the village and rumored to be the preferred replacement bell ringer. He asked me to help him once, Reed said nervously. Said I had strong arms.
Did you?
Miss Marple asked. Yes, Reed replied, a few evenings ago. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened.
And what did you notice?
Reed swallowed. He was angry.
Said someone was using the churchyard after hours. Did he say who? Miss Marple asked.
No, Reed said, but he said it wouldn't end well. Miss Marple thanked him and moved on. As dusk approached, she returned once more to the churchyard. Standing near the bell tower, she imagined Alfred Crowe arriving that night, perhaps summoned, perhaps suspicious, perhaps determined to confront someone misusing the sanctity of his domain. She walked the path from the gate to the yew tree slowly. The distance was short, too short for coincidence. She stopped abruptly. Near the base of the yew, partially concealed by roots, lay a scuffed patch of earth. Miss Marple knelt carefully and brushed away loose soil. A heel mark. Not Alfred's. Too narrow, too sharp. Miss Marple straightened. Someone had stood here, waiting while Alfred rang the bell.
Waiting while sound carried. Waiting until witnesses were guaranteed. The realization settled heavily. Alfred Crowe had not been silenced because he was weak. He had been silenced because he was precise. He knew timings. He noticed irregularities, and he would not have stayed quiet. That evening, Miss Marple sat knitting by her window, the sound of the silent bell tower looming in her thoughts. The village was beginning to settle on a new story now. An argument, someone said. Change unsettled him, said another. He rang too hard, concluded a third. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. People preferred explanations that required no villain. But ritual, when abused, was never accidental. And the bell, respected, trusted, unquestioned, had been turned into a tool. Someone had used Alfred Crowe's devotion against him. And in Alderwick, the person who knew when to ring the bell knew exactly why. Do you think Alfred Crowe was killed because he opposed change? Or because he discovered something meant to stay hidden? Share your theory below. Footsteps between the graves. Miss Marple had always believed that when people lied, they did so most convincingly about small things. In Alderwick, the small things lay between the graves. The heel mark she had discovered beneath the yew tree
troubled her far more than any rumor circulating in the village. It was not deep, but it was precise. A mark left by someone standing still, weight settled, waiting. People who waited like that were not surprised. They were prepared. Miss Marple returned to the churchyard in the clear light of morning. Without the drama of dusk, the place looked ordinary again. Weathered stones, tidy paths, a faint smell of damp earth. But ordinary places, she knew, were where careful crimes hid best. She paced the distance from the bell tower to the yew tree once more, counting her steps. 34. Alfred Crowe could have walked that distance easily. But the arrangement of his body suggested he had not walked at all, not willingly. Miss Marple turned her attention to the cottages overlooking the churchyard. Mrs. Edith Langley had mentioned voices. Miss Marple called upon her shortly after breakfast. "I didn't want to say anything at first," Mrs. Langley said nervously, twisting her apron. "Didn't seem proper." "Impropriety," Miss Marple replied gently, "is often confused with accuracy." Mrs. Langley swallowed. "I heard Alfred's voice. And another." "A man?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes," Mrs. Langley said. "Angry." "Lower than Alfred's." "Could you see them?" Miss Marple asked. "No," she replied. "Just shadows near the tower." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Shadows were useful things. That afternoon, the parish council convened again, ostensibly to discuss funeral arrangements, but Miss Marple sensed another purpose. Decisions postponed were now being rushed. Modernization was mentioned again. Thomas Reed sat stiffly at the end of the table, eyes fixed on his hands. Miss Marple watched him carefully. After the meeting, she approached him quietly. "You were with Alfred recently," she said. "Yes," Reed replied. "He showed me the ropes." "Literally," Miss Marple said. Reed forced a weak smile. "He didn't like me much." "Did he fear you?" Miss Marple asked. Reed hesitated. "He feared replacement." "And you?" Miss Marple asked. Reed flushed. "I just wanted to help." Miss Marple studied his boots. Clean. Too clean for someone who claimed to have walked the churchyard paths at dusk. That evening, Miss Marple met the churchwarden, Leonard Pierce, near the vestry. "Alfred confronted someone," Miss Marple said calmly. Pierce looked startled. "How could you know that?" "Because someone waited for him," Miss Marple replied, "and waiting requires knowledge." Pierce shifted uncomfortably. "You think it was about the bell?" "I think the bell was the excuse," Miss Marple said, "not the cause." As night fell, Miss Marple stood once more beneath the bell tower, listening to the wind move through the ropes. The bell itself remained still. Someone had rung it not in anger, but with intention, long enough to alert the village, short enough to avoid interruption. Timing. That was what Alfred Crowe knew best. And that was what had been used against him. Miss Marple looked out across the graves, their inscriptions catching the moonlight. A man who measured time had been killed at precisely the right moment, and whoever stood waiting near the yew tree had known exactly when the bell would stop ringing. Do you think Alfred Crowe was lured to the churchyard, or confronted there unexpectedly? Share your theory below. A convenient replacement. Miss Marple had always observed that suspicion settled most easily where benefit appeared simplest. In Alderwick, benefit had a name: Thomas Reed. He was young, capable, and, most importantly, available. In a village unsettled by death, availability was often mistaken for intent.
The parish council's whispered relief at his presence was almost palpable.
Like a breath taken too soon, Miss Marple noticed. She noticed how people looked at him now, not kindly, but with relief that blame might land somewhere manageable. That morning she watched from a distance as Thomas Reed unlocked the church for early prayers. His movements were careful, almost rehearsed. He wiped his boots twice on the mat before stepping inside. Clean boots again. Too careful, Miss Marple thought. She approached him quietly. "You've been helping quite a bit," she said pleasantly. "Yes, ma'am," Reed replied quickly. "I want to be useful." "Of course," Miss Marple said, "and usefulness is often rewarded." Reed flushed. "People think I wanted Alfred's position." "Did you?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I wanted to learn," he said. "That's all." Miss Marple nodded, but her eyes lingered on his hands. There were faint abrasions along his palms, old rope burns, perhaps, but not recent. Later that day, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at Mrs. Bellamy's cottage. The conversation turned inevitably to Alfred Crowe. "He was stubborn," Mrs. Bellamy said. "Refused to step aside." "And now Thomas will ring the bell," someone else added. "Naturally." "Naturally," Miss Marple echoed softly. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid another visit to the bell tower, this time with Leonard Pierce, the church warden. "Who has keys?" she asked casually. "Alfred did," Pierce replied. "And I do." "And the vicar?" Miss Marple asked. Pierce hesitated. "Yes, for emergencies." Miss Marple smiled. "Emergencies do have a way of being created." She examined the bell rope again. This time she noticed something new, a faint scent. Not stone, not dust. Oil. Bell ropes were rarely oiled. Doing so made them dangerous to grip. Someone unfamiliar might do it to ease strain. Someone experienced would never. That evening, Miss Marple requested something unusual. She asked the vicar if the bell might be rung again, just once, for comfort. Reverend Hargreaves agreed reluctantly. The rope was pulled, the bell rang, and Miss Marple watched. Thomas Reed winced. Leonard Pierce closed his eyes. But the vicar remained very still. Too still. Afterward, Miss Marple approached him. "You didn't expect that sound again so soon," she said quietly. He met her gaze. "It unsettles people." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "especially those who associate it with a particular moment." As dusk fell, Miss Marple returned to the yew tree. She stood precisely where the heel mark had been found. From this angle, the bell tower door was clearly visible, and so was the vestry entrance. Someone could have watched Alfred approach. Someone who knew he would come. Someone with authority to summon him without raising alarm. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Thomas Reed was too obvious, too new, too watched, too convenient. The true danger, she knew, lay with those who benefited from continuity, not change. And the bell, once again, had been rung at exactly the right moment. Do you believe Thomas Reed is being framed as a convenient suspect? Or does his eagerness hide something darker? Share your theory below. Those who hold the keys. Miss Marple had always found that power rarely announced itself loudly in villages. It rested quietly in pockets, drawers, and, most often, in keys. The morning after the bell was rung again for comfort, Alderwick felt unsettled. The villagers did not speak of fear, but they moved differently. Doors were closed more deliberately. Conversations ended when footsteps approached. Miss Marple noticed who did not look surprised. She began her day at the vestry, where Reverend Matthew Hargreaves sat reviewing papers with unnecessary intensity. "You rang the bell yesterday," Miss Marple said mildly. "Yes," the vicar replied, "at your request." "And it troubled you," Miss Marple observed. Hargreaves stiffened. "It reminded people of Alfred." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and of the night he died." The vicar's fingers tightened around his pen. Miss Marple continued gently. "Rituals become dangerous when they are interrupted, especially for those who rely on them remaining predictable." Hargreaves looked up sharply. "What are you suggesting?" "That you knew Alfred would come to the tower that night," Miss Marple replied calmly. Silence followed. She did not press the point. Truth, she knew, ripened best when left briefly unattended. Instead, she asked a simpler question. "Who locked the tower after the body was discovered?" "I did," the vicar said at once. "For safety." Miss Marple nodded. "And the gate?" "The constable." "Yet it had been opened earlier," Miss Marple said. "Intentionally." Hargreaves' gaze dropped. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked once more with Leonard Pierce, the church warden. He seemed more talkative now, perhaps relieved that suspicion had not settled fully upon him. "Alfred argued with the vicar," Pierce admitted quietly. "More than once." "About what?" Miss Marple asked. "Access," Pierce said. "Who was allowed in the churchyard after hours?" Miss Marple stopped walking. "Why would that matter?" she asked. Pierce hesitated. "Because the vicar has meetings. Private ones." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Privacy again. As evening approached, Miss Marple made her final visit of the day to Mrs. Edith Langley. "I saw someone else," Mrs. Langley confessed at last. "Not near the tower, near the vestry door." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Who?" "I couldn't see clearly," the woman said. "But he had keys. I heard them." Keys again. Miss Marple returned to her lodgings and laid out what she knew. Alfred Crowe had questioned late-night access. He had known when the churchyard was used. He had objected, and he had authority, quiet authority, to challenge misuse.
Someone with greater authority had needed him silent, not replaced, removed. The bell had been rung to summon witnesses, the body placed to appear natural. The gate opened to imply accident, and the keys had ensured everything happened without interruption. Miss Marple rose and looked out at the church tower silhouetted against the darkening sky. Authority, she knew, often believed itself invisible. But keys jingled, and bells remembered who last pulled their ropes. Tomorrow she would test something, and Alderwick's careful balance would begin to tip. Do you believe the person with authority in Alderwick could commit murder and still expect silence to protect them? Share your theory below. When the bell was watched. Miss Marple had always believed that truth revealed itself most clearly when people thought nothing was being asked of them. The day she chose to test Alderwick arrived without announcement. There were no meetings scheduled, no ceremonies planned. The bell was not expected to ring. That was precisely why she asked for it. "I should like the bell rung this evening," Miss Marple said calmly to Reverend Matthew Hargreaves over breakfast at the vicarage. "Just once, at sunset." The vicar stiffened almost imperceptibly. "There's no reason." "No," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly.
which makes it ideal."
Reluctantly, Hargreaves consented. Miss Marple spent the afternoon observing rather than questioning. She watched Leonard Pierce pass the churchyard twice, pausing to glance up at the tower.
She saw Thomas Reed avoid the area altogether, and she noticed Mrs. Edith Langley close her curtains earlier than usual. At sunset, Miss Marple positioned herself near the yew tree, the very spot where Alfred Crowe's body had been found. She waited. The bell rang. Not pulled by the vicar, not pulled by Thomas Reed. Leonard Pierce stood in the tower doorway, startled, hands empty. Someone else had rung it. The sound rolled across the village, solemn, deliberate, unmistakable. Miss Marple watched the vestry door. It opened. Reverend Hargreaves stepped out, pale and angry. "That was unnecessary," he said sharply. "Yes," Miss Marple replied calmly. "That was rather the point." She walked toward the tower with measured steps. Inside, the rope swayed gently, still settling. Someone had released it only seconds earlier. "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "no one admits to pulling it." Hargreaves' composure cracked. "Alfred used to ring it like that," he said. "Always, exactly like that." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "which is why it unsettles you." She turned to him fully now. "You rang it the night Alfred died," she said quietly, "because you knew exactly how he rang it." The vicar shook his head. "You can't prove that." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Proof is rarely immediate. Recognition, however, is." She gestured toward the bell rope. "Oiled," she said, "to make it easier for someone unaccustomed. You did not expect Alfred to notice the danger." Hargreaves swallowed. "You summoned him," Miss Marple continued. "Told him someone was using the churchyard improperly. You knew he would come. He always did." The vicar's voice dropped. "He threatened exposure." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "and exposure threatens authority." The villagers had begun to gather now, drawn by the bell's unexpected voice. Faces appeared at the gate. Murmurs rose. "He confronted you," Miss Marple said. "You struggled. He fell, or was pushed." Silence. "You arranged him," she continued, "folded his hands, placed his hat, rang the bell again to create witnesses." Hargreaves closed his eyes. "I didn't mean to kill him," he whispered. "No," Miss Marple replied. "You meant to silence him." The constable stepped forward. Miss Marple turned away from the tower and walked slowly back toward the yew tree. The bell fell silent once more, but this time it was no longer hiding anything. "Do you believe power corrupts quietly in villages, or does silence give it permission?" Share your thoughts below. After the bell fell silent, Miss Marple had always observed that revelation did not bring peace so much as responsibility. In Alderwick, the bell's silence after Reverend Hargreaves' confession felt heavier than any sound it had ever made. The villagers stood uncertainly in the churchyard as the constable escorted the vicar away. No one spoke at first. The bell rope hung motionless, its fibers still faintly glistening where oil had been carelessly applied, an unintentional confession left behind. Leonard Pierce broke the silence. "We trusted him," he said hoarsely. "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "Trust, when unexamined, becomes permission." Thomas Reed stood apart from the others, his shoulders sagging with relief and something like shame. "They thought it was me,"
he said quietly to Miss Marple.
"They thought what was easiest," she answered. "You were new. Authority rarely suspects itself." As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple remained near the yew tree. The earth had been smoothed, the heel mark long since erased by careful feet. Yet she could still see it in her mind, the place where someone had waited, confident that ritual would do the rest. Later that morning, the parish council convened again, this time without ceremony. Papers were shuffled, chairs scraped. Decisions that had once been deferred now demanded attention. "We should have listened to Alfred," Mrs. Bellamy said. "He warned us." "Yes," Miss Marple said from her seat at the back. "But warnings are inconvenient when they challenge comfort." Leonard Pierce nodded slowly. "He told me the vicar was using the churchyard late at night, letting strangers in. For meetings that required silence, Miss Marple said. And silence was guaranteed by authority. The council agreed, reluctantly, to open records, revise access, and share keys. Each concession felt like a small loss to those accustomed to certainty. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked with Thomas Reed toward the bell tower. "I don't know if I should stay," he said, "after everything." "Staying is not the same as replacing," Miss Marple replied kindly. "And bells require care, not ambition." Reed smiled faintly. Inside the tower, the bell loomed above them, unchanged and indifferent. Miss Marple looked up at it thoughtfully. "It was never the bell," she said softly. "It was the belief that it could never be misused." As evening fell, the villagers gathered for an impromptu service, not led by a vicar, but by a shared agreement. Leonard Pierce read a simple passage. There was no sermon, no ringing, only voices. Miss Marple listened from the back pew. Alderwick was not absolved, but it was awake. And awakening, she knew, was often the most difficult part. As darkness settled, Miss Marple returned to her lodgings and began packing. The case was not yet concluded, formalities remained, but the truth had been accepted, and that was enough for her. She paused by the window one last time. The bell tower stood dark against the sky. For the first time since her arrival, it did not feel watchful. It felt honest. "Do you think the village bears responsibility for allowing authority to go unquestioned? Or is guilt limited to the one who acted? Share your thoughts below."
The weight of authority. Miss Marple had always believed that the most difficult part of any crime was not the act itself, but what followed once the truth could no longer be ignored. In Alderwick, the truth now sat heavily upon everyone. The formal inquiry began quietly. No crowds gathered, no reporters arrived. The matter was handled, as the villagers preferred, with discretion. Yet discretion did not lessen the impact, it merely concentrated it. Reverend Matthew Hargreaves's statement was taken in the vestry where he had once conducted private meetings, shielded by trust and title. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The constable read carefully, his voice neutral, while Leonard Pierce and 2 council members bore witness. "I did not plan to kill him," Hargreaves said again, his voice subdued. "I meant to frighten him, to remind him of his place." Miss Marple, seated quietly near the window, noted the phrasing. Place. Authority always relied on it. "You summoned Alfred Crowe under false pretenses," the constable said. "You rang the bell to ensure witnesses, then attempted to make his death appear natural." "Yes," Hargreaves whispered. I believed the village needed order." "And you believed yourself its guardian," Miss Marple said gently. Hargreaves did not answer. Outside, the village waited. Mrs. Bellamy paced near the gate. Thomas Reed sat on the low wall, hat in his hands. Conversations were hushed, cautious, as though loud speech might still offend something unseen. When the constable emerged, his face confirmed what everyone already knew. The vicar would be charged. That evening,
Miss Marple walked once more through Alderwick's narrow lanes. Doors were open now, light spilling onto the paths where shadows had once seemed deliberate. The village was talking, not gossiping, but speaking honestly for perhaps the first time in years.
"He controlled everything," someone said. "And we let him," another replied. Miss Marple paused near the churchyard gate, listening. Leonard Pierce joined her. "We gave him keys," Pierce said quietly, "and never asked why." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Keys are rarely questioned until they open the wrong door." Inside the church, parish records were being reviewed. Names, dates, permissions, details once waved through by habit were now examined carefully. Alfred Crow's name appeared often. "He kept notes," Pierce said. "Times, visitors, concerns." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly.
And that made him dangerous. The realization settled heavily between them.
Later, Thomas Reed approached Miss Marple hesitantly. "I don't know if I want the bell now," he admitted. "After everything." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "The bell is not a prize. It is a responsibility." He nodded. As night fell, Miss Marple returned to her lodgings and prepared for departure. Her suitcase lay open, neatly packed, the case almost complete. She sat for a moment by the window, looking toward the dark silhouette of the bell tower. Alfred Crow had lived his life by time and order. He had believed in rules, but also in boundaries, even for those who wore authority comfortably. That belief had cost him his life. Miss Marple sighed softly. Villages often imagined themselves immune to corruption because it arrived without fanfare.
But corruption rarely announced itself. It borrowed respectability and wore it well. The bell would ring again one day, but Alderwick would never hear it quite the same way. Do you think authority becomes dangerous only when abused, or when it is never questioned at all? Share your thoughts below. Miss Marple had always believed that endings were not moments, but adjustments. Alderwick did not awaken transformed the morning after Reverend Hargreaves was formally charged. There were no dramatic gestures, no public declarations. Instead, there was a subtle shift in how people moved through familiar spaces, as though the village were learning to walk without leaning on something it had long trusted. The churchyard gate stood open, not carelessly, but deliberately. Leonard Pierce supervised quietly as the locks were changed and the keys redistributed. No single person held them all now. The sound of metal being handed from palm to palm carried a significance that did not require explanation. Miss Marple observed from a distance. Keys, she knew, were symbols far heavier than they appeared. Thomas Reed approached her near the tower, his expression thoughtful rather than eager. "They asked if I'd take over officially," he said. "The bell, I mean." "And what did you say?" Miss Marple asked. "That I would, if it remained shared, rotated, observed." Miss Marple smiled approvingly. "Bells do not belong to individuals. They belong to moments." Inside the church, records once kept private were laid out for review. Parish council members sat together, reading aloud decisions that had once been made behind closed doors. Mistakes were acknowledged, not dramatically, but honestly. "We assumed authority meant safety," Mrs. Bellamy said quietly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "It often does, until it doesn't."
That afternoon, Alfred Crow's belongings were returned to the village. His notebook lay open on a small table in the vestry, its pages filled with neat handwriting, times, names, small observations. He had not been spying, he had been noticing. Miss Marple ran her fingers lightly over the edge of the book. He had believed that noticing was part of caring for the village, and he had been right. As dusk approached, Leonard Pierce asked a question no one else had voiced. "Should the bell ring tonight?" he asked. There was hesitation. Miss Marple spoke gently. "Yes."
But not as it did before. So they rang it together, one pull, measured, unceremonious. The sound drifted across Alderwick, not commanding, not ominous, simply present. People paused, listened, and then continued on their way. The bell was no longer summoning silence. It was marking time again. Miss Marple stood beneath the tower as the final vibrations faded. She thought of Alfred Crow, faithful, precise, unwilling to look away when something felt wrong. He had trusted ritual, but he had trusted conscience more. That evening Miss Marple prepared to leave Alderwick. Her bag was packed neatly, her gloves folded with care. At the gate, Thomas Reed and Leonard Pierce accompanied her a short way. "We'll remember," Pierce said. "We won't let it settle back into quiet." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Memory is a form of responsibility." As she walked away, she did not look back immediately. Villages, she knew, deserved the dignity of being trusted with what they had learned. Behind her, the bell tower stood firm against the fading light. No longer sinister, simply honest. Do you think traditions protect communities, or do they sometimes hide what needs to be questioned? Share your final thoughts below. When silence loses its power. And so, dear listener, Alderwick returns to its routines, but not its old assurances. The bell still rings. The churchyard remains peaceful. But silence no longer carries authority. A man who watched too carefully was lost because others trusted too easily. And a village learned that reverence, when left unexamined, can become a shield for wrongdoing. Miss Marple leaves Alderwick quietly, as she always does, without praise, without acknowledgement, leaving behind not answers, but awareness. Because awareness is never loud. It does not ring bells or command attention. It simply asks one thing: who benefits from this silence? Thank you for spending this time with Miss Marple and with Alderwick's Uneasy Truth. If this mystery lingered with you, perhaps it is because it mirrors something familiar, something gentle that once went unquestioned. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts below. Which moment changed everything for you? Until our next mystery together, take care. And remember, when a bell rings at the wrong time, it is always worth asking, who pulled the rope?